So the first round was not nearly as organized and efficient as the next one.
No.
So I know it started off generally, right? We were like, we need to make these materials. And then I think the whole thing was like 6 months or something, right? Like what I do know is the first few months we did this whole like send out lots of emails to lots of people in different places and meet with them, right? And so we probably spent like 2 months at least going to random places in the country, meeting with random people.
Well, before then though, we even started with closer like people who were just like friends, just being like, oh, like your grandmother's rich, right? Like, do you want to like
That's right.
put us in touch with, or like, oh yeah, this like person's father is a VC.
That's right. We were
like,
who do we know that knows anything about the space?
Anything at all, because we didn't have a network, right? And so you're just like, oh, that person's vaguely related to startups, or like that person's rich. Like, let's just like try to talk to them.
That's right. Do you know? And it was like I had a friend who was in venture, or like a friend who was in startups, or something like this, right? So you
stuff the Duke Startup Lab,
right?
Stuff through
that's right. Anything you know, and of course you can send cold emails and meet. Like you can't send a cold email to Mark Andreessen, but you can send a cold email to like your local VC in North Carolina, and they'll talk to you, right? And so we did a lot of that, and we learned a bunch of things through these meetings. But we basically, I think what was probably helpful was we had a bunch of iterations, so it helped the deck for sure, and it helped the pitch. But we ended up, sort of spinning our wheels for a bit on this, and then and we were doing it sort of like part-time as well, because we also, I think, were applying to YC at the time and some other things.
But then we also were full-time working.
We were working, of course. We started to like meet actual San Francisco VCs with some regularity, and we'd go out to San Francisco and back like a couple months in, and so we'd keep flying out there and coming back like every weekend or something like this.
Well, basically, we were just like
random people.
Every time we would go to a city for another reason, where I was like, oh, I'm going to go to Connecticut to see my family from North Carolina, and I'm going to fly through New York, and we had 3 days there.
Right.
Or like, I'm going to go to San Francisco for this conference, and so we're going to like stay for an extra 3 days. Or like, you're going to go visit someone in Boston.
Right.
We would just like extend it by a few days.
Right.
And then we would just like send out these like mass emails.
And we would learn a good amount. And also, as you said, we were still building it, and we were learning like almost should we raise. And we were you could say it as like an extended period of testing the market, basically.
The first money we got in was through Duke. Like we met with our Duke professor, Dan Heath, who was like, he ran a bunch of books with Chip Heath, and they like are reasonably well known. And so he was down to kind of help support us because we were coming through Duke, and just the behavioral science connection. And so
that's right.
He wrote like a pretty small check, but was like, like, cool, you can use my name, you can put that in the blurb. And so we started including him.
Yeah.
That's right. That's why he was interested. He was like, I want to support what you're doing. I can't like write a $500,000 check here, but I can help you guys out with my name at least.
Right.
And we like started including that in the blurb, and then we got some like 1 or 2 commitments in from what we were doing, this kind of like spray and pray approach where we're just meeting with all sorts of people that way. We didn't even end up taking all of their money.
And then I think there was a big switch, probably around like through this kind of network thing. We knew of, and then had some friends who had been funded by, a guy named Jan Tallinn who started Skype, and through this and sort of through the philanthropy community almost, we were connected to him, and because of course we were working on a thing that was tied to this, we sent him. I think we sent him a cold email in response to like a Google group we were in. Like if you're really asking us about the details, it was like a Google group that he was in that we replied to him and said,
but it's like,
and it reflected that we were
kind of warm.
Exactly.
And it also like it's a relevant target. He was like interest, like the founder of Skype happened to be really interested in philanthropy.
Exactly.
And so it's like, it wasn't just a random person.
That's right.
Cold email.
And in fact, I think that's a perfect example where from the outside, he's just the founder of Skype. He's invested in 300 YC companies, right? He's like a pretty prolific entrepreneur and investor, but as it turns out, for what we were doing and who we were and who he is, we had this other connection, which ended up to be really important.
Yep.
And so then we had from what I remember, like a 17-minute Skype call with him. So Skype was still a thing at the time, and I'll never get over that his name was Jan on there. And then he was like, "I'll take a third of the round, kind of whatever you raise." And as you said before, this was like a big turning point where we could tell people, not only do we have a third of the round covered, but we also have this sort of person who brings this legitimacy to it. And then we added in that sentence.
But you know what's funny? When we started out, we were like, we were going to raise 250K because we were applying for YC. And the plan was like, all right, we're going to get like the 250 from YC. That's going to get us 3 months. We're going to really prove this thing out. And then we'll raise a big round after that. And so when we didn't get into YC and we started trying to do like, we're going to raise a round, we were like, all right, we're going to raise 250 or maybe it was 125.
Because YC gives you 120.
Yeah, that's right. We started with 125.
Yeah.
And you know, people just laugh you out of the room when you send emails saying like, oh yeah, we're going to raise 125. They're like, no.
Yeah,
way.
what are you doing? Yeah.
Right? And so we're like, okay,
how about decided not to go friends and family, I remember too.
That's right.
Like, that's too complicated. And I think that's a whole
it's
other
real
conversation.
messy.
Yeah.
That's right. And so we're like, oh, okay, let's pitch some people. We were pitching people who were like, well, we want to invest in a company that's going to become a massive company. It's not going to get anywhere on 125.
Right.
So we're like, okay, how about 250? And, you know, people still just would not even take the meetings.
Right.
And then we went up to 500 and suddenly people were willing to talk. And then they ask you like, oh, like, why are you raising 500? Like, how did you decide that amount of money? And you have to tell some story about like exactly how much money you think you need. And the answer's like, no, you wouldn't take the meeting the first 2 times they emailed you, right?
Yeah, so that is true. And then it's true that Dan, we ended up having in at the end. But you're right, to your point around soft commitments. I remember we went back and we were like, you know, do you actually want to put in the 10K? Like your commitment helped us get here to now having the million and getting oversubscribed.
Okay.
And so that part is really important, like having people kind of be up to help you that way. And then they can, of course, not join if they don't want to.
Then we're like, well, this is definitely going to close. We know between the money we had before that and his commitment that we'd be able to close the 500. And so then we started just emailing people and just kind of doing like, hey, this is going to close in a few weeks. And you can leave it kind of vague, right? We're like, oh, it's going to close in a few weeks. And we're like, who knows, right?
Yeah. I think Ulu was the next big.
That was the next big one, for sure.
So I guess at that point we were like, let's find a lead investor. Like we were at least very open to and intrigued to have a venture, to have a VC firm actually come join what we were doing. And so we did all this research. We did a bunch of the stuff that we went through here, although not nearly as cleanly. And then I think actually Ulu, there was basically a guy who had been chair of the board I went to undergrad at Grinnell, and so he was there and had grown up there at this small liberal arts school. And then he had done a PhD in like decision sciences at Stanford years ago. They're in their, I guess they're in their 50s at the time.
And also, I want to say that like, their daughter went to Duke.
There was this overlap,
and
so they had a bunch of this, and they were interested in social impact things.
Right. That was really
that's right. And Miriam, his partner, was like first 25 or something, very early at Google, and so they had this fund. And I think what we ended up, we had these initial meetings, and a lot of the initial meetings are just like, are you real and do we trust you and all this? And then as we started to get more traction on the round, I remember we had, I can't remember, it was like 3 or 4 meetings, but we had this one really big one where we all met them in Palo Alto and just had a really great chat, right? And went through it all. And their sort of approach, which is different than many others, is that they build this big, basically like regression model and look at, what's your market going to look like in 5 years with 80% confidence intervals, and try to assign some numbers and basically just say, like, if it comes out above a 10, let's say we'll invest, 500K or $1 million. And if it doesn't, we don't. And so we were talking to a bunch of leads at the time, but I do remember, I think I was still in California and you and I then were back in North Carolina, and we got this email from them. Or this, was it a call? No, I think it was an email we got that they were like, hey, we're going to come in, meaning we'll put in 500K. And so that was it.
Yeah.
Right? I remember that was like like we were feeling good already and talking to lots of different people, but it was unsure of whether it would still be like Jan and a group of angels and kind of thrown together, or we'd actually get an institutional.
Well, that was suddenly the first time that we had more money than we wanted, right? Because they're like, we normally write $500,000 checks. Y'all are only raising 500K, so we'll give you 250.
Right.
But we're like, oh, we like now have more than we need here, and then you're in a totally different ballgame.
Right. And so I think at that point, at that point we were like, cool, we will have an institutional VC in the round, and also should we raise $1 million, basically, right? Like it's better to say, even if you wanted to raise $1 million, you should say you're raising 500K, and then you get oversubscribed, and you can do this. You basically like the lowest amount of number that's still legitimate.
But you don't want to lie and like pretend you're going to raise 50, but like
exactly.
the real answer is like you don't know what you're going to raise, And so rather than like setting like a really high goal of being like, we're going to raise $3 million and then like only deciding to raise $1 million, it's like better to set like an achievable goal and be like, oh, we're going to aim for $1 million and then decide to raise 1.5.
Right. And so I think that's where we got to. We got oversubscribed on 500, and then at some point we decided to do $1 million, in part because of the advice of some of the people joining the round, and then it also let us fit in some more people. And of course, in hindsight, it turned out to be essential because we did end up getting down to no money in the bank account actually on that $1 million, and then became profitable a month later, right? So.
There's also this.
It ended up to be key.
There's this like funny, completely different second stage of that round, which is like after the oversubscription, we're like, okay, it's closed. We're like basically done at this point, and we're like just deciding between a few people. We had like gotten an introduction to this like one VC who was more embedded in Silicon Valley than most of the other people we've been talking to, and it's just night and day between like. Yeah, so all right, once we started talking to Shrug and Neve started making introductions, it's just like, oh,
right.
Like suddenly it just like felt like something out of a movie, right? Where it's just like, oh, this is just like what people are like imagining Silicon Valley is like, where it's just like, oh, you're getting like introed left and right to like the best VCs in the city, and like you're going around to like parties and office warnings and all this stuff. And that was a completely different type of fundraising than when we were just like in North Carolina doing spray and pray.
Like it's really important to find a hub, and this person can like he introduced to an NBA player, Delhi, who invested, and as you said, to lots of other like lots of other VCs, and then also it creates this like if you have somebody like that doing this, it just like you can almost. I can take something that Neve forwarded and send that to somebody else, and it creates this feeling of FOMO, right? It's like I'm in the round, I'm doing this. So, that was the like very positive few weeks of like trying to figure out the allocation and trying to just say who's the best people we can get in, and then you have to decide. We are going to shut it down though, actually, because we do have to. Start
you could have kept doing that for months, and it's just like people will keep inviting you, and they keep being interested, and you're getting all these fancy parties and whatever, and you're like, but we do need to build something at some point. And like even when we started talking to Neve, we were like, sorry, the round's full. But after he sends enough intros to like people you've heard of,
people like pay their way into the round by actually doing work, right?
For sure, we're like, all right, we'll make some room for you.
It was awesome.
He really put in some work for us, and we ended up with like 4 VC firms in the round, and like an NBA player and the founder of Skype and a bunch of different things. But that was a long journey from like we've said, it's just like. You get absolutely nothing for months. Right? It took us 6 months to do the whole raise, and we did nothing for the first 5 months of that or whatever. Like had $10,000, and then there's this wild spike, and it's like over in a few weeks.
So that first one, we really did on like sort of maybe in the order of what matters to folks, like team, market, product, and really put it together with like some early traction, and then also a bunch of a vision we had, and then the sort of round dynamics. The second round, what we had going for us is that we were, making $100,000 a month, and that
it helps when you're profitable.
It does, and it helps when it happened in like 3 weeks time. And so there was this like huge amount of wind at our backs, and it was coming around the election, and we had a product that was, or what we had launched at the time was every time Trump tweets, a group of people gave to a batch of orgs working to stop his re-election, let's say, working on basically pro-democracy issues. And so we had the sort of like cultural winds at our back, and then suddenly we had 40,000 users, and we're making a bunch of money, and so this was in our favor, and so it was a very different experience. It was like up and down. I don't know, a couple months. We extended it, of course, when we wanted to figure out who was allocating it. But
I actually don't. I mean, look, it certainly doesn't hurt to have 40,000 users and a bunch of that stuff. And we intentionally did time it to say like, we think the election like is going to come, and then maybe we're going to lose a bunch of users, and so we're like, we're going to try and time this right before then. But I actually think the thing that was the night and day difference was having a network. Where when I think about what happened when we raised the round. Once we reached Neve, even though we didn't have any traction in that product, that felt much more like the round we raised the second time around from the start because we've been living in San Francisco suddenly for 2 years.
That's right.
And so I think the thing that made the night and day difference was the knowing people and the rather than going spray and pray,
knowing how to approach it
and saying, you're just trying to get through to these 20 people.
Right.
Do everything you can in your power to get introductions to them and chase down something that's a 4-step lead to get there.
Right.
But do what it takes to get to those people. And obviously, like, look, there's a real reason that people move to Silicon Valley. Like, just by living here, you'll know people who then suddenly end up being able to introduce you later.
Right.
But even if you don't, it's just going to be, more steps. But it's about that approach of like, you're going after this small group of people and you're trying to feel like to them, you're part of their in-group. And if someone can introduce you, even if that took a week or 2 weeks to get that introduction, that's worth far more than the emails. And I think like what was different about the second round was even less that we had a product that was working, was just like, we've been here for 2 years. Right. And so we just, we did the first round in 6 months. We did the second round in 6 weeks. Right. And I think that's primarily just by approach and network.
But let's think about exactly how it went.
Well, we started with just people we knew who knew our target investors, right? And so it's like, the question is, who are you targeting? And then who can get you there? And a really good starting point is people who already invested, because a bunch of them are already friends, right? So we started just by going to our current investors and a bunch of our advisors and like other founders in our network at this point who had raised, and just saying like, hey, do you know any of these people? But after 2 years of being in the Bay, I mean, what's funny is this was the like first few months of COVID. And so it was like, no one was raising and no one knew how this worked. And so suddenly we did the entire thing via Zoom. Right.
That's what happened. So that is actually one thing to say, is that there was an incredible scare around COVID. And so we sorted through that. And then it turned out, of course, now we all know that COVID created conditions for like a lot of tech businesses to do very well. Right. And so suddenly there was like a pause on like basically capital being deployed. And then there was a whole bunch of it being deployed. And also at rates that were even faster because people could do Zoom meetings and had decided that they were comfortable with this. And so this was like, as you said, we went to like founder friends, and I remember like a friend of a friend asked to put in $50K. Like things were just moving way faster than they had been before, and much cleaner, where you'd say, okay, well, this person actually could bring something to the table. We'd love to have them in. We were getting soft commitments and stuff is starting to roll. And I think at that point,
we just knew how to do everything. Like everything we're saying here, it took us 6 months to figure out on our own. Right. And we already had done that. We already knew. And so, yeah, it helped that we just had a network of folks, but also it was just like a completely different mindset.
Right. I think maybe the only big shift that was unique about it was in our ability to basically like start to play institutional investors off of each other. And so we, built up a lot of the like, soft commitments from relevant people. And then we started to have some like micro VCs, or like one of our current venture groups wanted it again. And so we did that. And then we were talking to people to lead it, and, to a lot of people that would have made a lot of sense. And we even had, I remember like, we were very close to having like 2 or 3 term sheets from some people we really wanted. And then we did have somebody give us a commitment like this. And I think it was like at a valuation that ended up to be like 65% of the valuation we ended up raising at, because of what happened was when we took that commitment to them, we started to look at like, basically what happened is we got this term sheet, and then we had a list of people we really wanted to get to. And so similarly, we sent out to everybody saying, here's what we're doing. And even in this process, through like a friend of a friend or some other thing, we met this guy, Nico, who had started his own solo fund, and he was like super high conviction, moving super quickly. And he came in and was like, I just want to do this well above whatever.
We were already full at that point though.
Yeah, exactly.
Nico came in, right? So like one of the funny things is we were like, oh, this round we know full. We should do a lead. We're going to go after this and get a lead.
We got full without a lead.
And then we couldn't get a lead for a while.
Yeah.
And so after a while we were like, okay, guess we're going to try a different approach. So I think one of the things is, all right, we can tell you all these rules, but at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that everything goes perfectly that way.
No.
But what we did was we just said, okay, guess we're going to fill it with angels. And we had like all of these different like VC funds and angels who were like pretty well-known people, right? It's like the first thing that like pushed us over the line of the round being full was when Mark Cuban came in and was like, I'm going to put in $1 million into this. And then we were like already at that point had a bunch of commitments when he came in, and we were in conversations with a bunch of different leads. We decided to take Mark Cuban. Now the round was completely oversubscribed.
Right.
And then we'd set a price valuation that suddenly someone came in and said, I'm just going to keep increasing the valuation until you let me into the round, right? Because we were planning to raise that round to this amount, and then like we'd gotten a bunch of people excited about this, and we were like, sorry, we don't have room for you. And he was like, how about if I just keep adding the valuation until you let me in?
I want to put in 1.3, but I'll do it at whatever you'll let me in at.
And eventually we were just like, okay. And actually he offered like a higher number than we were like, we don't want to take that, right? But we ended up taking a valuation for that, and that kind of pushed everyone else up with him. And so we ended up, in fact, with like 2 people putting in $1 million each into this round, Mark Cuban and Nico from Adjacent, and then like a bunch of other much smaller checks. And we were like, okay, like we want to have Eric Reese in here, we want to have this, and like we want to have these people in here for like 50,000 on deck. Like who's going to be like useful, right? You start asking like who's going to be able to make interest other things, or who's going to be able to like get us users or give us advice, or all sorts of strategic questions, not just whose money do you need